Namamsi Bhuyamsi. A very good evening to you all and a happy World Philosophy Day. A warm welcome to all of you to the international seminar on the problems of perception by Dr. Aravinda Bhatt today and the philosophy of language in Vedic discourse by Professor Dr. Veernarayana Pandurangi tomorrow, organized by the Department of Philosophy, Manipal. Last year, World Philosophy Day of November was celebrated along with International Women's Day during this March. For the first time, an international seminar on Indian thoughts on language, literature, and morality by contemporary women philosophers in India was organized. Dr. Meera Baindur from Jaipur, Dr. Geetesh Nirban from Delhi, Dr. Shivani from Bengaluru had delivered the lectures on that occasion. All these seminars being organized are available at the Department of Philosophy Manipal YouTube channel. This year's theme is on epistemology, the theory of knowledge that deals with perception, reasoning, and language. And we have invited two scholars, Dr. Aravinda Bhatt from Manipal and Professor Dr. Veernarayana Pandurangi from Bengaluru. The theory of knowledge, otherwise known as epistemology, primarily concerns itself with the origin, nature, structure, form, content, and credibility of the jnana or ma or cognition, thus also known as pramana shastram or jnana shastram. Whereas the metaphysics, also known as ontology, concerns with the origin, nature, form, and existence of the jnana or meya. So it is called prameya shastram or tattva shastram. That is why it becomes a reductionism to term philosophy as tattva shastram. It is appropriate to translate philosophy as tattva jnanam, which discourses on tattva shastram, ontology, jnana shastram, epistemology, and also dharma shastram, ethics, and kala shastram, aesthetics. Similarly, the problem also traverses while translating the term jnanam as knowledge, as jnanam may be valid or invalid, but knowledge is conceived to be justified true belief, as it is already justified. So there is no scope for falsity in knowledge. That is why knowledge is prama and not jnana. Stephen Phillips iterates this in quote, however, proper Sanskrit usage allows false jnana, whereas there is no false knowledge as the words are used in English. And he comments that a common failure of translators rendering the technical terms of the Indian epistemological schools into the technical terms of English and analytic philosophy is ignorance of the latter. Therefore, one should exercise caution while interfacing and translating Indian and analytic as well as continental philosophical schools of thought. In both Indian and Western traditions, the theory of knowledge has produced a vast resource of knowledge base. Those inquiring into the fundamental natures and attitudes of knowledge, what is knowledge, what are its causes and effects, what are its contents, how is it represented, how does one know that they know, are knowledge and its contents real, true and factual, what is the relation between knowledge, its knower, known, and the cognitive or epistemic means of knowledge. While the Nyaya, Indian, and analytical, Anglo-American traditions concern themselves with the truth value of knowledge, the experience of knower, conscious self, is emphasized in Vedanta and phenomenological traditions. For instance, Vedanta asserts the subjective understanding of ontological reality is experiencing oneself, thus leading to disputes between idealism and realism as well as empiricism and rationalism. While there is an enormous amount of philosophical literature that emphasizes the importance of empirical observations and perceptions, for example, Ananda teertha or Acharya Madhva of 13th century Vedanta philosopher states that nacha anubhava virode agamasya pramanyam, meaning language wouldn't be credible if it contradicts perception in his Vishnu Tattva Nirnaya. But what sort of perception he is referring to? is clear only in his another work, Brahmasutra Bhashyam. Shastrartha Yuktanubhavaha Pramanam Tuttamam Matam. The perception, corroborated with rational investigations and discursive analysis, is testimonial than mere sense-object contact. The question, why so, paves the way for the today's lecture on the problems of perception. This today's philosophical lecture on the problems of perception is delivered by a promising scholar who lives with a visual disability. This living experience will perhaps lend immediacy to the philosophical problems of praxis familiar to us from theoretical discourses. I am really thankful to Dr. Aravind Bhatt and Professor Pandurangi, to these speakers, for accepting our humble invitation and delivering this World Philosophy Day lectures for us. And I also extend a cordial invitation to them and to you, the ardent listeners, students, researchers, faculty members, friends, colleagues, and other knowledge seekers who are present here offline and online for this international seminar. I extend a special welcome to the departments and its members that I am very closely associated with: European Studies, Philosophy, Languages, and University Press. Without much ado, I request my colleague, MAHE Mahabharata Research Senior Fellow and guest faculty, a DOP, Dr. Ananda Teertha, to introduce the eminent guest speaker and the topic to the audience in brief. Over to you, Ananda.
Good evening, all. It's my pleasure to introduce our own colleague, Dr. Arvind Bhatt. Oftentimes, we hesitate to highlight highlight the achievements and expertise of our colleague, assuming that we all are familiar with their achievements. But sometimes we are all familiar with sometimes we take this familiarity for granted. So in this time, I'd like to give you some insight into Arvind Bhatt's expertise. Dr. Arvind Bhatt is an assistant professor at the Department of Languages, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Manipal. He holds a PhD in English literature from the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. He teaches European literature in translation, intellectual history of Europe, research practices, and German. His research interests include literature by blind and visually impaired authors, disability studies, and philosophy. Through his work, he indulges his love of books. Today, his talk takes the inability to perceive objects, both visual and auditory, as the starting point, and goes on to delineate the implication for knowledge about different kinds of perceptual reliefs. In the process, he will speak about other sensory modalities such as touch and olfaction. The inability born of sight loss, and the necessity faced by the blind person to recalibrate their relation to the external word forms one prong of the argument, while what to make of a person's inability to perceive an object when they do not live with the loss of the sense that is supposed to capture, it forms the other. This contrastive problem will occasion discussion of well-known Western and Eastern misunderstandings concerning perception. Now I request Aravinda Bhatta to deliver lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ananda. So I thank Dr. Srinivasa Kumar Acharya, head of the Department of Philosophy, MAHE, for extending this invitation to me to deliver this lecture on the occasion of World Philosophy Day. I would like to begin by dedicating the following remarks to my first philosophy teacher, Professor Javed Alam uh, of course, he ended his teaching career at EFLU, that is English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. He was, I mean, he's no longer with us, sadly. He was a great political scientist and philosopher, did yeoman service to Indian democracy through his activism in Himachal Pradesh. He was a Marxist and a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. He was a great thinker, and Who Wants Democracy is one of is a book that I would highly recommend. It's about Indian democracy. With the dedication, I would like now to make a couple of caveats. Firstly, I'm a rank outsider to philosophy. My knowledge is, gained through desultory reading. I have done a little bit of work in philosophy for my PhD, but my passion is in philosophizing on a daily basis. Although my reading is not as extensive as a professional philosophers might be. So today, when I talk to you about the problems of perception, as Dr. Ananda Acharya has just told you, I will talk about visual impairment, blindness, also failures of perception in people who do not live with any loss of sensory modality, sensory organs. My vocabulary will probably be idiosyncratic because, as I said, I'm not a professional academic philosopher. With this, I will begin. I came to philosophy some 12 years ago. As I was embarking on my research career, I did an MPhil at the English and Foreign Languages University because, to be honest, after MA, I was at a loss. What do I do next? Because the job market was looming and it frankly scared me away. And I'm grateful to that because I love research and I love teaching. I think these two go hand in hand. So my teacher, my mentor, the Dr. Rajiv C. Krishnan, he's a poet and a teacher. He said, "Why don't you do work on literary works by visually impaired and blind people? Um, it will give you an opportunity to probe your own, selfhood and through literature." So this is what I did. Um, so one of the first articles I read about philosophy of perception was by the philosopher of mind, the Professor David Chalmers. The moment I started reading that article long ago, some 12 to 13 years ago. So I'm afraid I will not be able to outline the argument. However, the thing that struck me was he made general remarks or generalized conclusions about perception after discussing simply qualia, visual deliverances of objects. So, color, the perceptual experience of seeing color, and so on. So, this struck me even then, as a total beginner, how can you make general remarks or general conclusions, draw general conclusions about perception generally by simply talking about vision? So obviously, this sort of critique arose because I was working on writings by visually impaired and blind people. So ever since then, I have wondered that philosophers of perception and epistemologists have to do work in the area of uh, multisensory perception, not just vision. Okay. Now it turns out that since the 1990s, psychologists and philosophers have been observing that philosophy of perception has, over the last 2 millennia or say 2300 years in the West, beginning with Plato, um, has concentrated, or philosophers of perception have concentrated on vision mainly. Okay, for Plato, for instance, his idea of the ideal forms, that exist beyond this realm, the sensory worldly realm, in some ideal place, that is perfectly represented by geometrical figures. Okay, so geometrical figures are to be drawn, right? Even music is supposed to be so the Timaeus, his work, the Timaeus says that even music is supposed to be represented through number. Okay, so numbers and geometrical figures, they form um, the route through which the ideal forms and say music. Why music? Music is sounds. It's a harmony. It's sounds. They are to be represented through number, right? These are visual. Come to Descartes. Descartes, some in the 16th century, 17th century actually. I'm jumping here, but he performs a radical turn in Western philosophy where he brings reason within the human subject. Okay, the thinker. For Plato, reason was elsewhere. So it's the good that every person has to strive for. Okay, but for Descartes, reason resides in the thinking subject. Okay, so he philosophizes, or his method of philosophy is radical skepticism, okay, or radical doubt about the existence of the outside, external world, even about the self, right? So um, he comes to the conclusion that because he doubts, he knows that he exists. Okay, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Of course, this is this has now become a sort of cliche. However, it does no harm to repeat that, for a simple reason that for him the external world, the perceivable world, is susceptible to radical skepticism. We do not know if the external world actually exists. Why? Because we can only perceive what is delivered to us by objects outside us. Okay, we do not perceive objects independent of ourselves. Okay, so this is skepticism. For this reason, he has to resort through to doubt or doubting as the signifier of thinking. Okay, doubting is thinking, and this proves the existence of the self. And then he appeals to God, the existence of God, because God cannot be doubted. This he remember he was functioning in in the in an environment where religion was all powerful, so he could not very well say that God does not exist. Okay, So of course that task comes later in the 18th century. However, Descartes appeals to God and says, because God is somebody who does not deceive us, the external world exists, and so on. Now, the point I want to make here is that for Descartes, vision performs the role of perception generally. So, for instance, he says that even when we hear sounds, sounds are imprinted on our, on our mind, like an imprint made on wax. Okay, so you put a solid object on wax, on soft hot wax, it gets imprinted. Okay, in the same way, sound makes an imprint on the mind. Okay, so this is a visual metaphor. Okay, for this reason, philosophers in the current contemporary period now, say beginning in the 1990s, okay, there have been a number of philosophers. I was reading Casey O'Callaghan. His book is called um, Beyond Vision: Philosophical Essays. Uh, he makes it clear that philosophers in the last 3 or 4 decades have been making the have been saying that it is important for philosophy of perception to look at other sensory modalities independent of vision. Vision cannot be generalized. Okay, now let me simply give a few examples here. So some years ago, I was sitting with a companion. She was my PhD classmate. We were sitting in a canteen, a university canteen in Hyderabad, and the person, we had ordered for some food. We had placed an order for food, and the cook was making it, and he was beating out a rhythm on the skillet, the frying pan. And I remarked to her, "Look, listen to that. It's so rhythmic, it's like music." And she her response was, "What are you talking about?" So this, I would say that she was not even aware of the rhythm inherent in that the beating of the frying pan. um, uh, so she could not perceive firstly the sound. Okay, so sound is the object of auditory perception. She could not perceive the sound, and she could not infer that this man, the cook, was beating that rhythm on his frying pan, maybe perhaps unconsciously. Okay, and she could not perceive the pattern, the sound pattern which made up the rhythm. Okay, why am I saying all this? Contrast this inability with this famous folk tale from India, of the uh, a number of blind men, 6 blind men. One telling says, looking at an elephant, right? I'm sure all of you know the story that one blind man touches the trunk, says it's like a tree. Another person says it's like the it's like a flap touching the ear. Touches the body, says it's like the elephant is like a wall. So it falls to a sighted person. I'm sure there are a number of retellings, tellings of the story, but in the one I read, the Raja, who is of that realm, the kingdom, he's a wise man. He says, you have to all put your various conceptions together to make the elephant. So it falls to a sighted person to point out their error. Okay, now compare this story with the story I just narrated of this sighted person who is not deaf. Okay, she did not have a hearing impairment. She could not perceive the sound pattern in the ambient environment. Okay, so can we now say that she is ignorant? Yes, she was ignorant of the sounds, but to draw a general conclusion about the ignorance of blind men, you know uh, in comparison with this friend of mine, uh, can we conclude that she is an ignorant person? Not at all. In that situation, she was ignorant. Why were the blind men ignorant of the shape of the elephant? Because it is too big to touch. Okay, for blind people, touch is important, sound is important, or hearing is important, right? This is quite straightforward. If you have seen or interacted with a blind person, you would know that. For them, hearing and touch are very important. The elephant is such a large beast, and for one person to touch it completely is impossible. This is why, it's not because the blind men were stupid that they were ignorant. It was the situation presented to them was beyond their ability to touch. Okay, just as the music or the rhythm in the beating of the frying pan was beyond my peer, right, in hearing. Now, I'll narrate one more story. Some years ago, I was traveling with a colleague. This was a decade ago, and we passed by a flyover. This was in Hyderabad, and I asked him, "So just tell me how the flyover looks." I thought that there was a weird turn when the auto rickshaw moved across. Past it. He said, "I'm not able to describe the flyover to you." Right? So he is visually, quote unquote, normal, but he was unable to describe to me the shape of the flyover. So there's this writer called Georgina Klieg. She is visually impaired, and she says how on September 11, 2001, when the World Trade Center was struck and the towers fell, the witnesses, the eyewitnesses, quote unquote eyewitnesses, were not able to describe the falling of the towers visually. There was smoke and dust, the smell of petroleum, the air fuel, and terrible dust. Okay, so they could describe only auditory, olfactory, and tactile phenomena, but not vision. Okay, so I'm just telling you that it is not simply straightforward, or it is not possible to simply draw the conclusion that because the blind men were not able to comprehend the elephant, the shape of the elephant, that they are ignorant, globally ignorant. No. Okay. Now you might, the philosopher might argue that no one is drawing a general conclusion about the blind men or blind men's knowledge, but that is belied by the general cross-cultural understanding that blindness leads to ignorance, unconsciousness, right? So I'm kind of venturing into culture here from the purely philosophical realm, but remember that for me, I am following the the example of, say, people like Socrates, Søren Abai Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, who deal with questioning reality, everyday experiences and realities. Okay, so there's this book called On Blindness, Letters between Brian Magee and Martin Milligan. Now, Martin Milligan was a blind philosopher who taught in England, University of Leeds. He and this cited philosopher Brian Magee exchanged a few letters, I think 6 or 7 letters. Then Milligan died, so they could not continue the conversation. But the book is about blindness, so it's a philosophical analysis of blind experiences, blindness, and broader philosophical questions. Okay, now Milligan says that for blind people, language descriptions play a similar role to sight. Okay, so if things that occur, or events that occur around a blind person are described to him or her, that linguistic description plays the role of sight. It gives them knowledge. Okay. Now there are parallels here. Think of the in Indian philosophy you have the pramana of apta vachana, right? The words of a trusted source. So blind people can ask people, other people, sighted people for description, which is what I did in the case of the flyover, right? But my colleague was not able to describe it. So there are gaps in perception, be it blind people or sighted people, within the realm of sight, within the realm of hearing, okay, and definitely within the realm of touch. And I'll tell you why. You take an object, a sufficiently complicated, sculpted object, say a stone or any postmodern piece of art, say steel or glass or ice or whatever, touch it. It should be complicated, not simply a spherical object. It should be complicated. It is very difficult to comprehend at one go what that object is. Remember, only through touch. The problem is that sighted people will immediately look at the sculpted object and say, it is this. It is shaped like a woman, or it is shaped like a dog, or whatever. But only through touch. If you touch it, if you explore it, it takes time and effort to comprehend that object. Okay. Why? Because touch requires education. Contrary to everyday expectations, touch is not all that untutored. It requires education. Okay. Right. So I request my the organizers to let me know if I overshoot time here. Okay. I hope I have time. Okay. All right. So that is one thing, right? So looking at sculptures, for instance, touching them, you have to run your fingers over the object slowly and try and associate the things that one touches with their linguistic descriptions. So, oh, I'm touching the face of this, this object. It might be a man or a woman or a child. Okay, then okay, the eyes are here, the nose is here, the etc. etc. So you build the picture in your mind slowly as you touch the sculpture. Okay, that is important. Now I will give you two examples. Okay, now philosophers of perception, they not only look at everyday perceptual experiences while talking about sight, and recently even about other perceptual experiences. They also appeal to thought experiments, to reports, and reports about perceptual experiences and so on. So there's this writer called Oliver Sacks. He was a doctor, and he has written extensively on disabled perception. Now, for instance, one philosopher of perception that I came across recently, he made a brief allusion to what Sacks says about neurological issues in perception. So let me give you a couple of examples here to talk about a number of broader questions. First, one of the authors that I worked on for my PhD was John M. Hull. He was a religious thinker and educator in Birmingham, University of Birmingham. And he wrote, he's no longer with us, he's dead, he passed away in 2015. Okay, he wrote 2 diaries on the experience of becoming blind in midlife. So he was 45 when he became blind. Okay, and he maintains a diary over some 4 or 5 years to record his daily experiences with blindness. Okay, it was therapeutic for him. That was the reason he maintained cassette diary. He recorded his experiences every day, every morning. Okay, he recorded dreams, everyday experiences, and so on. Now, one major problem that he encountered in his transition from being a visual person to a blind person was how to know what exists outside is really there. What exists outside him, because he was a visual person. He lived on his vision, okay, before becoming blind. So when he became completely blind, he says that in 1980, he realized that he could not make out sunlight. Okay, he was very blind, right? So for him, he experienced claustrophobia, okay, and panic, because he had difficulty in assuring himself that what existed outside really existed. It was not some delusion of his mind, some hallucination, So this looks very much like the skeptical problem raised by Descartes. Okay, how to know what one knows is true, is there, is really there. Okay, so for him, um, the skeptical problem holds very true. Okay, how does one know that what exists in the external world, or even the external world for that matter, does in fact exist? Okay, now for him, blindness gave rise to that problem. And over the next 3 years, he learns by way of the thought delineated, expounded by the phenomenologist, the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Okay, how to reorient himself to the external world through the other senses. Now, I am aware that I'm jumping from the analytical tradition to the continental tradition, but I'm not alone in doing this. I'll come first to my methodology here. Why? Because okay, there's this philosopher called Erin Plunkett, and he has written this book called A Philosophy of the Essay. Okay, now he talks about certain philosophers in the modern period, such as Montaigne, the essayist. He's known for his essays. Montaigne, David Hume, the paramount skeptic, of the Scottish tradition. Then the early romantic philosophers of Germany, Schlegel and others. And then Soren Kierkegaard, whom I've already mentioned. Okay, and Stanley Cavell, the American philosopher. These people resist systematizing philosophy. Okay, why is systematic philosophy dangerous according to this long tradition of thinkers, marginal philosophers? Because it divorces philosophy from everyday life. Even Martin Milligan, the blind philosopher I mentioned, in his epistolary exchanges with Brian MAHE, refuses to move, resolutely away from everyday experiences of blindness. He takes everyday examples of walking down the street, asking people's help as a blind person, about his dilemma or his bewilderment at how sighted people drive cars, buses without colliding into objects and people. Remember, he was sighted in very early life, just for 18 months, but due to infantile amnesia, meaning most of us don't remember our earliest experiences. Say 4 years is said to be the threshold. Okay, so for Milligan too, his earliest memories are after his 4th year. Okay, so he does not remember anything of his visual experience. Okay, so he does not know what sight is, what light is. Okay, his mental makeup, his neurological makeup is totally blind. Okay, so he talks about how blind people experience the everyday world. Okay, and how they undergo everyday experiences. So I'm following in this tradition of marginal philosophers and sticking to everyday experiences and so on. And I resist super specialization in philosophy. Okay, making it too scientific, for instance, that it goes beyond my knowledge, because I'm not a scientist. Okay, in the analytical tradition, I have seen the tendency to scientificity, scientificity. Okay, appealing to hard sciences. Okay, uh, of course, philosophers such as Janardhan Ganeri, the Indian philosopher, he also makes use of studies in neurology, neuroplasticity, cognitive sciences, and so on. Okay, I mean, there is great value in such philosophy. Okay, there is great value in systematic philosophy of the German idealists and so on. But there is also place for marginal thinkers who want to keep philosophy tethered to everyday life, to everyday reality. Okay, so back to Hull. So through the thought of Merleau-Ponty, okay, Phenomenology of Perception, his book, he learns to reorientate himself to the external world through the whole body, okay, changing his perceptual predilection from sight, from vision to hearing, touch, and bodily perception. Okay, there's a seldom discussed perceptual mode called proprioception, which tells you your own bodily position. Oh, I'm sitting now. Oh, I'm standing, or etc., etc. Okay, so it's not vision. You don't look at your body while you're sitting. You just know that you're sitting. Okay, so a disability scholar called Jim Swan, he says that if Descartes had paid attention to proprioception, he would not have promulgated the mind-body duality. Okay, so here Descartes says that the body is separate from the mind. It is the mind which decides through doubting, through thinking that I exist, the world exists. Okay, but proprioception evidently. So for Descartes, the pineal gland connects the mind and the body, but proprioception, according to this scholar I mentioned, Swan, should have told Descartes, if he had paid attention, that the mind and body are connected very closely. So, okay. Anyway, so through the phenomenological thought of Merleau-Ponty, so according to Merleau-Ponty, even before scientists and social scientists and cultural theorists talk about human experience and how it is constructed and so on, even before that, the person, the individual, is already in the world and knows the world. It is pre-scientific. It is by its nature. Okay, man is in the world. Okay, man, woman, child is in the world, and we, even before we theorize our experience, we know that the world exists. So through this phenomenological move back to the things themselves, as Husserl, the German philosopher, the phenomenologist, says, through this movement, Merleau-Ponty and then Hull, for my purposes, reorientates himself not through sight but through the other bodily modalities, perceptual modalities, to the world. Okay. Now I will move to another example. There's this writer on whose work I wrote my thesis also. Like I took up 3 authors. So the next author is Stephen Cosisto. He's a poet and memoirist from the US. Okay, he develops an aesthetic of listening in his work called Eavesdropping. Okay, now this might be on a tangent from pure philosophy, but what I want to tell you about is his descriptions of how he, as a child of 4 years, and moving forwards as an adult, he is open to the auditory world. Okay, the world of everyday sounds, not just beautiful sounds, even ugly noises. And he develops an aesthetic of listening through his essays, 29 essays. Okay, and he, he does not use the word phenomenology, the philosophical stream, but he gives you a very good example of phenomenological thinking about perception through other senses other than sight. Okay, now for him, in one essay he talks about how he goes to the woods, to the forest in New Hampshire in the US, northeastern USA, and he sits in the forest listening to crows singing, or he says, use the word singing, but quarreling also, right? And so he's open to these sounds in the ambient environment, and he develops these remarkable descriptions of the heard world. Okay, so these are some examples of how individuals without sight can orientate themselves to the world and live full lives. Martin Milligan lived a very full life. He had a child. He was married. He had a child. He was a Marxist, an activist. He worked extensively for the blind in England. Okay, he lived in England, so he lived a complete life that way. So did Stephen Cosisto and John Hull. I'm giving some good examples here. Okay, but they did live complete lives. Since they made use of their other perceptual modalities to know the world, to understand what was going on around them. Now you will ask, if the blind person does not experience limitations. Yes, they do. Okay, limitations are inconvenient. We cannot drive a car, for instance. Okay, or we cannot walk down Indian roads with absolute safety. Okay, however, that is not to say then that the blindness is a complete lack. It is an emptiness. Not at all. Okay, Georgina Cleave, the scholar I mentioned earlier, she writes a book about art and blindness. Okay, it's called just give me a moment. More Than Meets the Eye. Okay, that's a book. She talks about aesthetics and blindness, but she says that this philosopher Arthur Danto criticizes her for not being totally blind and offering thoughts about perception, blind perception. So philosophers want purity. A blind person has to be totally blind to give anything of value to of philosophy of blind perception. And she says that that's absolutely stupid, because most blind people have some residual sight. That does not mean that they're sighted creatures. They are not. Okay, they live in and through blindness. Their avenue of interaction with the world is blindness, which means that they interact with the world through other senses, and they can offer valid points about philosophy of perception from that place. Okay, so I think I am done here, and of course I am open to questions from audiences online and on site here. And I should have begun by thanking my colleagues, my friend Srini and Mr. Putti, my respects to Professor Neeta Ananda, head of European Studies, Department of European Manipal Center for European Studies, and others, my colleagues here, and thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aravind Bhatt, my dearest colleague, for such a fascinating session. At least I can say I am excited after this. And thank you so much for remaining true to the spirit of World Philosophy Day. I think it has filled us with enough enthusiasm on this occasion. Now, if there are any questions from those who have joined us online, as well as those who are here with us, from any perspective, as you could see, the topics that he covered were quite wide-ranging. So, any questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes, Sandeep.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Just a practical question based on what you told your experience.
Sandeep, just could you please say a few words to introduce yourself, just
Sir, I am.
and a little louder. Sorry.
Sir, I am Sandeep Kumar Suri. I am a student of Indian philosophy, first year in the MAHE itself. So my question is based on what you said today. Because to be true, it was a new, like the example that you gave, that you cannot see the highway and you had to depend on other verbal testimony. And sometimes that is not enough. Even if that is enough, so did you test that what you get from others? Means for things that you cannot touch, how do you get the knowledge of things?
So yes, I mean, as I hinted there, for me, linguistic descriptions play a major role. And I wrote an article recently, which was published in the Caravan, about watching movies with the audio description. You know, this new tool, and I talked about philosophical implications of linguistic descriptions. Okay, and they play a very important role in giving me knowledge. Now you can ask me, but how do you rely on somebody's description? Is that sufficient? As Srini said, you know, is it justified true belief? Is it knowledge? Now, there it is important for me to appeal to a person I can trust. You know, as you say, as you know, the Apta Vachana. Okay. Now, many a time I have had this experience. That flyover experience was quite unique. But I have had this experience. As I walk down the road, some random person will, shout at me and say, turn left, turn right, or turn left. He or she would say, and if I turned left, I would fall in the ditch. Why? Because he was talking about his left, not my left. Okay, so when you're sitting there and saying turn left, you're talking about my right. So this is not reliable knowledge, right? He should have said turn to your left, right? So this problem is faced by many people. So yes, verbal descriptions are not always sufficient. They're not justified true belief. They cannot be justified. Okay, but do you always, as in your everyday sensory experiences, do you usually question your sight? Oh, am I hallucinating at this moment? We don't do that generally, do we? So yes, I mean, for philosophy it is important to establish that what we see, what we hear is justifiable, it can be justified. But on an everyday basis, we usually rely on what we hear. Okay, as a blind person, I do.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Sharad, yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sharad, second year student there at MAHE. I want to give a small anecdote to give a background to my question. In my mountain guiding career, I had I had a team member who we have a phenomenon called snow blindness, where if you are exposed to the snow a lot without adequate UV protection for your eyes, you go blind temporarily. I had not my own client, but in a co-group in Himachal Pradesh. So we had a person not having any sight for over 16 hours. So one of the questions that we had at the end of the day was, do people remember how does the process of memory work when visual input is not available for a person? Because we rely on visual memory a lot. I mean, there is in memory itself there is a part of vision. So what is the form of memory, if I could say so, for someone who does not have a visual input? I'm sorry, this is not very philosophical, but
yeah, no, fair enough. My talk too has not been, purely philosophical, so fair enough. But yes, I mean, my memories of objects, of people, of routes are all as per my perception. So I have a very tactual memory. Okay, so my map is also is very tactual. It is also based on the residual sight that I have. So yes, a pure philosophically minded thinker like Arthur Danto might say, but you're not blind, because you're using sight. And I have no answer to that. Yes, I do use residual sight, but my maps are more multimodal, multisensory. And I'll tell you how. I know that this building is, it's tall and it's shaped. I suppose, there again, I don't have great clarity on it. It's probably shaped like a rectangle, a tall rectangle. Okay. But inside, I know that, okay, if I turn this way, I'll go to that room. If I turn this way, I'll go to that room. So it's multimodal, multisensory. So it's based on residual sight. It's based on walking in that place, so tactual. It is based on the sounds I hear. Now there's this minute philosophical discussion in analytical philosophy about whether sounds are aspatial, or do they relate directly to the source of the sound. I would say that for me, sound is not aspatial. It gives me an immediate knowledge of where that sound is coming from, the object that it is coming from. Very often I use this, ability to hear, to navigate. Okay, I'm walking along the corridor and there are two people talking softly. I don't want to kind of bump into them, so I hear carefully and say, okay, they are there, so I should not bump into them. Okay, so for me, sound is not aspatial. The other thing I failed to raise while talking was about echolocation. The sensory capability of bats. Okay, to bounce sounds from objects and learn very detailed things about objects around them. Okay, so even blind people have the ability to echolocate. So if you walk by the side of a wall, if I walk, I'm able to sense the wall even without seeing, using my residual sight. I can hear the sounds bouncing off the wall and hitting my body. So echolocation tells me that yes, I am 2 inches from a wall, or I am 2 feet from a wall. So yes, for us, hearing is important. And coming back to memory, I don't have visually rich memories. My memories are as per my perceptions. Yeah.
If I may kind of take the liberty to ask one more non-philosophical question, and which is triggered by the question asked by the person before me. So since he asked about memory, I'm also quite curious about how is dream perceived. Because for me as a scientific person, I mean, there have been instances where actually I have had dreams where there is no sight, there's only sound, but instantly it turns out to be a nightmare for me. It's almost when it's a nightmare that the sight actually kind of just vanishes and there is sound. Okay. So now just I'm curious as to how visually impaired person would actually get about the perception of dream.
No, so my dreams are also, I mean, I must stick to that position that my dreams are, I experience it when I see a person in my dream, it is just the outline of that person. I can't see her or his face. Okay, so it's the same way. Okay, now I asked a question to a completely blind person once, the same question. I asked him, how are your dreams like? And he said, that's, and this is not a comment on your question, but he told me, it's such a stupid question, because I dream as I perceive, right? So, there is no mysterious potential in a dream that, oh, this blind person can, I'm not implying that you asked that, but there's no mysterious phenomenon where the blind person can dream in technicolor. No.
Yeah, I mean, it popped up precisely because we see the dream. I mean, that's how we actually conceive the idea of dream as something which is seen, right? So, I mean,
yeah, no, my
language itself is a bit
yeah, no, my dreams.
Side-oriented.
Yeah, language is highly. It draws on visual perception and auditory perception. It's not nothing surprising in that. No, but I whatever residual sight I have such images in my dream. I also have sounds, and I mean nightmares. Well, my nightmares come from the character of the narrative and not simply the perceptual features.
Just to add to this thing, also I think Gautam, someone else also had the same question. I'm Srini. So in Upanishads, dream plays a very important role in a generation of knowledge. And the Upanishads have very clearly, distinctly described the nature of dream. I would like to quote one, is that drishtancha, adrishtancha, shrutancha, ashrutancha. So it says seen and unseen. For example, I have had dreams that are very weird, like where I was teaching to myself, like the another Srini. And when someone came and told me that I am teaching to Srini, are you aware of that? And I saw that one also who spoke to me was Srini. And these three people, I know I am Srini, but I did not see their faces in the dream. But I know I am that. Okay, Cogito ergo sum. I know that I am that because here it's not I'm thinking. I know that I am that. And at the same time, I got shocked, shell shocked, and I was worried and I was panicking. And it's not hallucination because I woke up after when my dream was over. I was sweating. And I had cold feet, and I had perspirations and other bodily phenomena that could speak that I was dreaming. When someone else came and told me that Srini, you are teaching to Srini, and I woke up, and actually when I woke up, I saw Srini sleeping, and that was also a dream. So, and like this, I have had multiples of complicated dreams, in which, like the way Upanishad has very clearly described, the mind has the capability of producing multiple cells and multiple taking help of from other koshas, antakarana koshas, and it is almost like a 3D theater. It projects something that is unimaginable. So even when I have sight and I perceive the world as it is, or even when I don't know about the person who does not have a sight, because I don't have that experience, that living experience, but given my couple of dreams experiences and the way I have heard about a lot of people speaking about dreams in casual conversations or in academic talks and scientific discourses, I mean, I'm asking you a very personalized question: is that in your dream, you said that of course you dream because you take some sort of whatever experience you have, maybe some sort of, I don't know how is your visual perception that works, but other tactile perception, olfactory perception, and the other perceptions that you have. Now, does this, what kind of picture that it gives? I mean, it's very abstract to speak about dream, but in terms of like what sort of picture that it illustrates you, like what do you get in dream?
So you know, when I dream, I see certain the rooms that I have been through, that I have walked through, that I have sat in. I once dreamt my grandparents' house, and I was moving through it, and I have dreamt of swimming in a particular body of water, and it's very eerie. It's really eerie. That body of water I never want to visit again in my dreams. It's strange, you know. So these experiences. So how do I see them? I see them, you know. So for instance, if I were to dream one day about the sixth floor here, I would see it the same way as I see the room here now, the corridor here now. So I can see the outlines. I can you know, just make out the wall there. You know, not in any great detail. I can see people's figures, but not their faces. They're not their gender. So all these things, you know, this is how this is the picture. And you know, sounds. Strangely, I've not dreamt much in sounds or touch. Okay, of course, that water, the feel of the water, I have. I think I have intuitively, you know, had it. You know, okay, this is how that water feels. And what else? Smell, I don't know. I don't recall any. So yes, I mean, I cannot say in much greater detail, because and this is a problem I have faced even in talking about my everyday experience. Not this is waking experience. An elderly person who is one of my, like, you know, my grandfather's cousins. He asked me, like, how is your sight now? 5 years ago you were not able to see well. How is it now? Has it improved? Has it worsened? And I said, actually, I cannot remember, because I don't remember how it was 5 years ago. You know, I cannot say in great detail how it was. So, you know, the passage of time changes your memories, right? But yeah, I mean, in the dream world, as I said, you know, it corresponds, at least the images correspond to my everyday experiences. But your dream, I must say, was very Borgesian. You know, the author Borges, yeah? Yeah.
So there are some of the, you know, online questions are also there.
Yes,
Some interesting observatory remarks.
Yeah.
So Hitesh had one question. I'll read it out for everyone, and if possible, then we can answer it and engage in a dialogue. So he has written, says, how touch is differently educated. As you mentioned, touch requires education. To the people who encounter blindness with different temporality of age, and how does it affect their gender relations?
Well, I don't know the answer to this question, but why does touch require education? Because you know, when you touch a sculpture, okay, I'm not talking about touching the desk. Okay, the moment I touch this thing, I know it's a table, it's a desk. The moment I touch the hand of the chair, arm of the chair, I know it's a chair arm. But say touching a complicated sculpture, okay, a statue, and okay, this is the hand, this is the leg, this is these are the other parts of the body, okay. It takes time to make out through touch alone. You use sight to say, okay, that is the statue of a woman, okay, but you touch it slowly, touch the face, and then the museum curator or somebody will come and you are not supposed to touch it, okay. That's a different matter. But yes, it takes time to comprehend, to conceptualize what you're touching. So remember that perception and concepts go hand in hand, okay. Phenomenologically, you are aware of the world before theorizing it, but to theorize you need concepts, okay. So there's this analytical philosopher called Alban Noy. He says that perception and concepts are very necessary. Perception cannot happen without concepts, okay. So no, about the question of gender, I'm not very sure. I won't answer it because I don't know the answer.
Okay. Hitesh, would you like to respond or ask another question related to this?
No, if there are other questions, I suggest we.
There's another question by Srini. Is that the same one?
There are other people.
Yeah.
You're unable to something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I?
Take this. Instead, Hitesh wants to speak,
I think Hitesh wants to speak. Hitesh, please go ahead.
Just a follow-up. So, can we consider that perception and concepts are like interrelated for the blind person then?
Certainly. Because just think of it, as I was saying, when you touch a sculpted noun, I'll use the example of something else, not a statue, but a complicated figure. Okay, it could be an elephant or I don't know, some unicorn or some dragon or something. How do I make sense of the sculpture as I touch it? By concepts, I mean the concept of the bodily part, the body part, the structure of the dragon. So I have to constantly appeal to concepts while I'm touching it. That is why I said that although when you hold a ball or when you hold somebody's hand, you don't have to conceptualize it. You know it. Yeah, that's a hand. But yes, even unconsciously, you have to appeal to concepts. Okay, but that comes to the fore when you are touching a sculpture, a complicated sculpture.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the
Yes,
next question after this. So there's one question by this participant, Shama. She says, or if I'm not wrong, what would be the ways in which an engagement with questions of epistemology through disability studies would allow for perhaps a reconfiguration of the relationship between belief and knowledge?
Okay. Reconceptualization of epistemology through disability studies. Yes, I mean, as I said, philosophers such as Martin Milligan, so there was this philosopher called H.H. Price. I have not read him. He was not blind, but he was Martin Milligan's teacher. He said you have to bring your personal experience to philosophy, not just read books, but you have to bring your personal experiences. So yes, through disability studies, which theorizes disability experience, we can reimagine, reconceptualize epistemology. So as I said, Milligan does that. Then Maurice Merleau-Ponty, although he was not blind, he does talk about perception in quote unquote disabled people and so on. So that is possible. Then Georgina Klieg. She's not a philosopher, but I would, think of her writing as philosophical. She does that, as does John Hull, Stephen Cosisto. Yes, of course. People like, I don't know, people like, say, P.F. Strawson or Arthur C. Danto will not consider these people as philosophers, but I would say that they are marginal philosophers. So we can do this, I think. I don't know if I've answered that person's question, but yes, I think it is possible to reconceptualize epistemology.
I think the whole objective of this talk or lecture would be this, that if we possibly look at any of the introductions to problem of perceptions, even those published recently, you would find that the problem of perception as traditionally conceived in epistemology is primarily about, whether our experience of the world, what is the, true or false status of it. For instance, whether things are the way they appear. And in most of these, one thing that we forget to notice is most of the examples or situations presented by the philosophers and the writers is that of visual, of seeing.
Absolutely.
There's very little account of auditory, tactile, gustatory for that matter. All these organs which make up for the experience, the perceptual experience as a whole. And most of these sensory organs are sort of taken as supplementary to this whole act of seeing. And so I think Professor Aravinda always says that, he's not possibly a philosopher, quote unquote, per se, but he's been quoting Merleau-Ponty. And I would like to, and it's surprising that he's also someone that I've been reading recently. And there's something that Merleau-Ponty says in his preface, which I would like to dedicate to Dr. Aravinda as a colleague. I would say, so let's start with the question, who is a philosopher? It's World Philosophy Day. Who is a philosopher? Let's see what Merleau-Ponty says. So he says, this is in his preface to Philosophy of Perception, Phenomenology of Perception. The philosopher is a perpetual beginner, which means that she takes for granted nothing that people, learned or otherwise, believe they know. A philosopher is a perpetual beginner, which means that she takes for granted nothing that people, learned or otherwise, believe they know. It means also that philosophy itself must not take itself for granted. It means also that philosophy should not take itself for granted, insofar as it may have managed to say something true. What it is, that it is an ever-renewed experiment in making its own beginning. An ever-renewed experiment in making its own beginning. That it consists wholly in the description of this beginning. So if there is, philosophers have continuously debated what philosophy is about, and they have given their own conceptions of this term philosophy. One thing we have to remember that there's nothing non-philosophical about philosophy. Everything, every kind of question that we ask, at the heart of philosophy, what we have is skepticism, the spirit of questioning. So there's no question which was asked today which was non-philosophical. There's no insight shared which was non-philosophical. So, and Russell says this, Bertrand Russell says this, that a philosopher is a philosopher. For a philosopher, nothing is finite, or nothing is definite. He or she takes nothing for granted. And the true value of philosophy lies in its uncertainty, of being a continuous inquiry about the questions ever answered or ever asked. So with this, I think we come at the conclusion. Okay, I'm so sorry, please.
Yes.
Other day we discussed about that synesthesia.
Yes.
Like
Cross-perceptual, cross-sensory perception.
Yeah, this question may be answered if I can. Just wanted to ask is that can we see or can one see through his ears?
Okay.
Can you listen through your eyes like that?
Okay. About the second one, I cannot say much, but about seeing through hearing. Now, I take an experience from everyday life. When sitting in front of my house, there's this a vehicle just goes down the road. I can follow it with my ears as though I was looking at it. So my ear pinpoints where that object, the vehicle is moving. Okay, that is why I said sound, contra some philosophers, is not aspatial. In my understanding, it does indicate space. Okay, it does indicate the source of the event of sound. So I can hear an object, okay, and I use the word I can see the sound. Why? Because it is so very vivid. Okay, and taste and smell are very deeply connected because they're chemical senses. But people do say, "Oh, I can taste the smell." You walk. I mean, unfortunately, this is most evident when you smell something very bad. Okay, you can even taste it. It's like that. But if you were walking in a garden with multiple flowers, you can actually taste the fragrance. Okay, you can almost taste the juice of that smell. So yes, I mean, perception is possible even in here.
And epistemology that Nayayika's belief is called as Alaukika Sanikasha. And they say that there are three kinds of Alaukika Sanikasha. Samanya Lakshana Pratyasati, Jnana Lakshana Pratyasati, and Yoga Lakshana. Example is that Suravi Chandana kind of the sandal wooden lies far from the cognizer, and there is no connection that is established with the olfactory perception and the object. Despite that, the person is able to say Suravi Chandana Kandaha is basically because of already existing perception that the Laukika Sanikasha, the I don't know how to translate Laukika Sanikasha, but the connection between the episteme and the object that is already established and experienced before plays. Dvaita plays a very important role in this explaining this particular part, and Sudha has very well elaborated this part. So it takes an interesting ahita shakti. So the object and the epistemic means that the person has, who has already had the experience, becomes potent here to produce the knowledge, even though the netra, the eyes, is incapable of producing the olfactory perception. So that would be also an additional input on this discussion.
Indeed.
And one more thing, then what's your response for that statement?
Which one?
That there is no, the things never exist if you don't see it.
Things do not exist when you don't see them. Okay. So there's this famous, example of, does a falling tree make a noise if it is not perceived by anybody? Yeah. What do I think of it? Well, it's a metaphysical question. We do not know for certain that objects that we don't see don't that they exist. I don't know how to answer that question because it's beyond my knowledge right now. So I think Srini might be able to talk about that more.
Just an insight about that question. This question is not very simple because it's tied with the whole history of epistemology. So to answer that question, you will be exposed to this a variety of conceptions that different philosophers have given in different time periods, perhaps. And the entire if we ask a question why epistemology exists as a discipline, it is because of this very question, that do the objects that we witness or that we experience, do they have a mind independent reality?
Indeed. That is a skeptical problem.
Exactly, to begin with. And that is something, the problem of the external world. This is something that is very traditionally known as a very important epistemological problem.
But I would like to, sorry to interrupt.
No,
yeah,
please.
But there's this book called Retrieving Realism by Charles Taylor and someone else. I would recommend reading that because realism has always been called into question by modern philosophy. Okay, it's called naive realism. So, but there's the book Retrieving Realism might be an interesting read actually for all you know, because I have not read it, so I cannot quote it or anything. But thanks for kind of realigning that question for me, because now it makes sense. It's a skeptical problem. Yeah.
And it remains unsolved, I guess, for everyone.
Yeah.
That's why you said it's a metaphysical question.
So, any more concerns, questions, queries? Okay. So I think, okay, so I wanted to read out a few, remarks that have been coming in our chat box. And I'll start with what Hitesh says. He says, it was good to hear Dr. Aravinda after a long time. Thanks for organizing the lecture, DOP. And then we have another response from Siddheshwar Shastri. He says, Aravinda, hats off to you for your stellar achievements, along with the faith and belief of an excellent way of life. That is evident to me. Send an email. Please check it when you have time. So, yes. And then Swati KS says, the session was very good. I really appreciate the speaker for analyzing the philosophy of perceptual problems among sighted and specially abled people. So,
thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much to everybody. Yeah.
So I think with this, we can finally conclude the session. And as we know, no session, no event comes about without the contributions of those who made it happen. So I'll take this moment to acknowledge and appreciate the contributions of those who made this event possible. And I start by thanking Professor Arvind Bhatt, our dearest colleague, for being our esteemed speaker, for helping us celebrate the World Philosophy Day.
It's a privilege. I cannot, actually imagine that I have spoken about philosophy on World Philosophy Day.
A philosopher is a perpetual beginner.
Yeah, I thank you for,
So, and we thank also Manipal Academy of Higher Education for making this possible, physically offering institutional support. And with this, we also thank our colleagues from Team EPLP, our neighboring departments, Professor Dr. Neeta Ananda from European Studies, Mr. Ramakriti from Department of Languages, and of course, Manipal Universal Press, Mr. Arvind Narigal. Sir, we'll also be presenting you with the 2 esteemed publications of your choice from MUP. So please do let us know later which of the books you would be choosing. Finally, and most importantly, to all the students and participants gathered here, a big thank you for making this session so enthusiastically driven. And last, and never the least, my colleagues from DOP, for making this event possible and for always driving forward the bandwagon of philosophical inquiry. So thank you so much for today. Thank you, everyone. And we see you again tomorrow, if possible for everyone. So for another session. Tomorrow. So tomorrow there's another session which is wholly online, right? And it has already been announced earlier. You could also check our posters.